The morning I found the text messages on my husband's phone, I was folding his laundry, the same laundry I had folded for 18 years, and my hands would not stop shaking as I read the words, "She understands me in ways you never could." Before I tell you what happened next, and how one single text message unraveled everything he thought he had gotten away with, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a broken life, and if you believe that even in our darkest moments there is still room for hope and second chances, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows because of people like you, people who still believe that love, even when it breaks, can teach us something worth carrying forward. Now let me tell you about Margaret Holloway, and the spring that changed everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Margaret was 52 years old, a woman who had spent most of her adult life believing that steadiness was the same thing as safety. She had married Richard Holloway when she was 24, back when he was a lanky insurance adjuster with an easy laugh and a habit of bringing her daffodils from the gas station because he said real flower shops felt like showing off. They built a life together in a modest brick house on Larkspur Lane, in a quiet town outside Portland where the rain came often but never seemed to dampen the sense that things were, on the whole, good. They raised 2 children, a son named Thomas who now worked as a paramedic 2 states away, and a daughter named Claire who had just started her final year of nursing school. Margaret taught 3rd grade at the elementary school down the road, a job she loved with the kind of quiet devotion that never made headlines but shaped 100 small lives every year. Richard had worked his way up at the same insurance firm for over 2 decades, and by the time this story begins he was a regional manager, the kind of man who wore his tie a little loose by afternoon and complained about his knees when it rained. For most of their marriage, Margaret would have told you, without hesitation, that she was happy. Not the loud, cinematic happiness of movies, but the deep, unglamorous happiness of shared coffee in the morning, of knowing exactly how someone took their eggs, of falling asleep to the sound of another person's breathing and never once wondering if they would still be there in the morning. She had watched friends' marriages crumble over the years, affairs, boredom, slow resentments that calcified into silence, and she had always felt a quiet, private gratitude that her own marriage seemed immune to that kind of rot. Richard was not a romantic man, not in the traditional sense, but he was consistent, and Margaret had come to believe that consistency was its own kind of romance. It was a Tuesday in early April when the ground beneath her began to shift, though she did not know it yet. She was folding towels in their bedroom, the window open to let in the smell of wet lilacs from the yard, when Richard's phone buzzed on the dresser where he had left it charging. She was not a woman who checked her husband's phone. In 18 years of marriage she had never once felt the need. But the phone buzzed twice more in quick succession, insistent in a way that made her glance over out of simple curiosity, the way anyone might glance at a ringing phone in an empty room. The screen lit up with a name she did not recognize, Elena, and beneath it, a preview of a message that made her stomach drop before her mind had even finished processing the words. "I keep thinking about yesterday. You make me feel like I'm the only woman who's ever really seen you." Margaret stood very still, a folded towel still in her hands, and felt something in her chest go cold and quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm breaks. She told herself, in that first frozen moment, that there had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was a colleague venting about her own marriage. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, words taken out of context. Margaret was not a woman prone to hysterics. Her whole life she had been the type to gather facts before drawing conclusions, the type of teacher who waited to hear the whole story before assigning blame in a playground dispute. So she picked up the phone, her hands steadier than she expected, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and she opened the messages, because some part of her needed to know rather than to guess. What she found was not a single moment of weakness. It was a relationship, weeks deep, tender and detailed in a way that told her this was not the first time these 2 people had spoken, not the first time they had shared a meal or a laugh or, apparently, an afternoon together while Margaret believed her husband was at a conference in Salem. Elena, it turned out, was a 39-year-old marketing consultant Richard had met at a regional business retreat 2 months earlier. The messages were affectionate in the specific, devastating way that only comes from genuine attachment, not the frantic, guilty language of a man having a fling, but the calm, settled language of a man who believed he had found something real. In one message, sent only 4 days earlier, Richard had written, "Being with you these last few weeks has shown me what I've been missing all this time. You get me in ways Margaret stopped trying to a long time ago." Margaret read that sentence 3 times, as if repetition might change its meaning, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs no longer felt capable of holding her up. She did not scream. She did not throw the phone across the room, though some wild, wounded part of her wanted to. Instead she sat there for a long time, the towel still balled up in her lap, listening to the birds outside the window as if they might offer some explanation for how 18 years of marriage could apparently mean so little to the man who had promised to build a life with her. When she finally stood, she placed the phone back exactly where it had been, screen down, and she finished folding the towels, because some deeply ingrained part of her did not know what else to do with her hands. Richard came home that evening at his usual time, 6:15, smelling faintly of coffee and the particular staleness of an office building, and he kissed Margaret on the cheek the way he did every day, a gesture so automatic it had long since stopped feeling like affection and had simply become punctuation. He asked what was for dinner. Margaret told him, in a voice that surprised her with its calm, that she needed to speak with him before they ate. Something in her tone must have registered, because Richard's easy expression flickered, just slightly, the way a man's face flickers when he senses a door he has been quietly leaving unlocked is about to be found open. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten 10,000 meals, where their children had done homework and blown out birthday candles and once, memorably, spilled an entire pot of spaghetti sauce across a stack of Thomas's college applications. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply told Richard what she had seen, repeating Elena's name and the words, "You make me feel like I'm the only woman who's ever really seen you," with a steadiness that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. She watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession: shock, a flicker of something like relief that the secret was finally out, and then, unmistakably, shame. He did not deny it. Margaret would later say that this was almost worse than if he had lied, because it meant he had accepted, somewhere along the way, that this was simply what his life had become. Richard's explanation, when it came, was the kind of explanation that men have been giving for centuries, dressed up in slightly more modern language. He said he had not meant for it to happen. He said that Elena made him feel young again, seen again, like the man he used to be before decades of routine had worn him down into someone he barely recognized. He said, with what Margaret suspected he believed was honesty, that he still loved her, that this was not about Margaret's failures but about something missing in himself. Margaret sat and listened to all of it, and what she felt was not the searing rage she might have expected, but something quieter and more devastating, a kind of grief, as if she were attending the funeral of a marriage she had not realized was already dying. She did not ask him to leave that night. She was, if nothing else, a practical woman, and she understood that decisions made in the first raw hours of betrayal are rarely the ones a person can live with later. Instead she told Richard she needed space to think, and she moved into the guest bedroom down the hall, the one with the daybed where Claire used to sleep when she was sick and wanted to be closer to the sound of her parents' voices downstairs. Margaret lay awake that night for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying 18 years in her mind like a film she was suddenly watching with new eyes, searching for the moment things had started to go wrong, the moment she had missed. The days that followed were some of the strangest of Margaret's life. She went to school each morning and stood in front of 22 third graders and taught them about fractions and the water cycle and the difference between similes and metaphors, and she smiled and laughed at their jokes about lunch food, and no one in that classroom had any idea that she was walking around with a hole blown through the center of her chest. She would come home in the afternoons to a house that looked exactly the same as it always had, the same worn armchair by the window, the same photographs on the mantel of Thomas's graduation and Claire's white coat ceremony, and yet everything felt subtly wrong, as if the house itself had been quietly replaced with a very convincing replica. Richard, for his part, seemed to genuinely believe that confession alone would be enough to fix things, that admitting the affair and promising to end it with Elena constituted the whole of his obligation. He was contrite in the way people are contrite when they have been caught rather than when they have truly reckoned with what they have done. He brought home flowers, not daffodils this time, but an elaborate bouquet from an actual florist, which Margaret found almost insulting in its irony. He suggested they go to dinner, as if a nice meal at the Italian place on Fifth Street could somehow undo the fact that he had told another woman she understood him in ways his wife of 18 years never had. Margaret began to realize, in those first weeks, that the hardest part of this ordeal was not going to be forgiving Richard. It was going to be figuring out whether Richard was even capable of understanding what needed forgiving. It was around this time that Margaret called her daughter Claire, not because she wanted to burden a 23-year-old with her marital troubles, but because she found she could not carry the weight of the secret alone any longer. Claire listened quietly on the phone, and Margaret could hear her breathing get tighter and more controlled, the way it did when Claire was trying very hard not to cry. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was thick with an anger that surprised Margaret, a fierce protectiveness that made Margaret realize her daughter had grown into a woman capable of a kind of loyalty Margaret hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. Claire offered to fly home immediately, to take a leave from her clinical rotations, but Margaret told her no, not yet, because she did not yet know what kind of story this was going to become, and she did not want her daughter to rearrange her life around a chapter that might still resolve itself quietly. Margaret also confided in her closest friend, a woman named Dorothy Pruitt who had taught kindergarten in the same school for nearly as long as Margaret had taught third grade. Dorothy had been divorced twice and remarried once, and she had a way of speaking about heartbreak that was neither maudlin nor dismissive, simply clear-eyed and true. Dorothy told Margaret something that stayed with her through the following weeks, that the question was never really whether Richard was sorry, because almost everyone is sorry once they are caught, but whether Richard was capable of becoming a different man than the one who had done this in the first place. "Sorry is easy," Dorothy said, stirring sugar into her coffee at the little diner where they met most Saturday mornings. "Sorry is what you say. Changed is what you do. You watch what he does, Margaret, not what he says, and you'll have your answer." Those words became a kind of compass for Margaret in the weeks that followed. She did not immediately file for divorce, though the thought crossed her mind more than once, particularly in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep would not come and her mind circled endlessly around Elena's name. Instead, she told Richard that she needed to see, through his actions, whether he understood the gravity of what he had done, and whether he was willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust rather than simply waiting for the storm to pass. She insisted that he end all contact with Elena immediately, not just claim to end it, and she asked, point blank, whether he was willing to go to marriage counseling with her, not as a formality but as genuine, humbling work. To Margaret's surprise, Richard agreed to all of it, though agreement, she reminded herself, was cheap. What mattered was follow-through. They began seeing a marriage counselor named Dr. Anwen Castellan, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s whose office was decorated with dozens of small potted succulents that Margaret found herself staring at during the long silences that punctuated their early sessions. In those first weeks of counseling, Richard's contrition often curdled into defensiveness the moment Margaret pressed too hard on the details of the affair, on why he had felt entitled to seek elsewhere what he claimed he still wanted from her. Dr. Castellan was patient but unflinching, gently pointing out to Richard, again and again, that his instinct to explain his affair in terms of what he had been missing was itself a symptom of the problem, a refusal to reckon with the simple fact that he had made a choice, a series of choices, each one a small betrayal building on the last, and that no deficiency in his marriage obligated him to lie to the woman who had spent half her life beside him. It was during one of these sessions, in the 6th week after Margaret's discovery, that something in Richard finally seemed to crack open in a way that felt different from his earlier performances of remorse. Dr. Castellan had asked him to describe, in detail, what he imagined Margaret had felt in the moment she read those messages, sitting on the edge of their bed with a towel still balled in her lap. Richard had started to answer in the abstract, saying he imagined she felt hurt, betrayed, angry, and Dr. Castellan had stopped him and asked him to try again, this time imagining it not as a concept but as a lived, physical experience, the cold drop in the stomach, the sudden strangeness of a familiar room, the particular loneliness of being betrayed by the one person who was supposed to be safest. Richard had gone quiet for a long moment, and then, to Margaret's shock, he had begun to cry, not the tears of a man caught and afraid of consequences, but something that seemed to come from someplace deeper and more frightened. He said, haltingly, that he had spent so long thinking about his own dissatisfaction, his own sense of having become invisible in his own life, that he had never truly let himself imagine what it would feel like to be Margaret in that moment, and that when he finally did, he felt something close to horror at what he had done. Margaret would later say that this was the first moment she believed real change might be possible, not because his tears erased what he had done, but because for the first time since the discovery, Richard seemed to be looking outward rather than inward, seemed to be genuinely grappling with the impact of his choices rather than simply managing the consequences. It did not fix anything immediately. Margaret still moved through her days with a wariness that had not existed before, still found herself checking, almost involuntarily, for the small tells of dishonesty she had never before thought to look for. But something had shifted, and she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the marriage she had built over 18 years might yet be salvageable, not as it had been, but as something new, forged with a harder-won honesty. The road from that session to anything resembling healing was neither straight nor short. There were setbacks. Margaret discovered, 3 weeks later, that Elena had sent Richard one final message, a plea for him to reconsider, and though Richard had shown the message to Margaret unprompted and then blocked Elena's number in front of her, the discovery reopened a wound that had only just begun to close, and Margaret spent that night in the guest room again, uncertain whether she had the strength to keep doing this. There were nights when she looked at Richard across the dinner table and felt nothing but a cold, tired anger, and afternoons when she caught herself crying in her classroom supply closet during her students' recess, ambushed by grief at the strangest moments, seeing a couple holding hands in the grocery store, hearing a love song on the car radio, finding an old photograph of Richard at 26, grinning at her with an expression she now wondered if she had ever really understood. But there were other moments too, moments that began to accumulate slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, moments that told a different story than the one Margaret had feared. Richard began coming home earlier, not because Margaret demanded it, but because he seemed to understand, on some level Margaret could not fully articulate, that trust was rebuilt not through grand gestures but through 1,000 small, boring acts of reliability. He started cooking dinner some nights, clumsily at first, burning a pot of rice so thoroughly that the smoke detector went off and both of them ended up laughing despite themselves, a small, fragile laugh that felt like the first real moment of ease between them in months. He began asking Margaret real questions about her days, not the perfunctory, "How was school?" he had asked for years without truly listening to the answer, but specific questions, about a student named Beckett who was struggling with reading, about a lesson plan Margaret had been excited about, questions that suggested he was trying, in his clumsy, imperfect way, to see her again, to actually look at the woman he had spent nearly 2 decades married to. Margaret's children, meanwhile, navigated the crisis in their own ways. Thomas, ever the practical one, called his father directly and had what Richard later described to Margaret as one of the hardest conversations of his life, a conversation in which their 30-year-old son, now a paramedic accustomed to speaking to people in their worst moments, told his father plainly that he did not know if he could ever fully respect him again, but that he hoped, for his mother's sake and his own, that Richard would prove himself capable of becoming a man worth respecting. Once more. Claire, for her part, remained more guarded, coming home for a single weekend in May under the guise of a study break, watching her parents with the sharp, assessing eyes of a young woman who had spent the last several years learning to read patients for signs of what they weren't saying out loud. She did not fully forgive her father that weekend, and Margaret did not ask her to. But she did notice her daughter softening, slightly, when she caught Richard washing dishes at 10 at night after Margaret had gone up to bed, an act with no audience and no immediate reward, the kind of act Dorothy Pruitt had told Margaret to watch for. It was in early July, 3 months after that fateful Tuesday with the folded towels, that Margaret experienced what she would later describe as a genuine turning point, though it arrived in a form so ordinary that she almost missed its significance. She had come down with a bad case of the flu, the kind that leaves a person weak and feverish and entirely dependent on someone else's care, and Richard had taken 2 days off work, unasked, to nurse her through it. He brought her soup and ginger tea, changed the sheets when she sweated through them, sat beside her bed reading aloud from an old mystery novel because she said the sound of his voice was the only thing that made the fever dreams recede. On the second night, as Margaret lay in the dim light of the bedside lamp, weak and hollowed out but finally starting to feel human again, she watched Richard fall asleep in the armchair beside her bed, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, the novel open on his chest, and she felt something in her that she had not expected to feel again so soon, not the giddy, uncomplicated love of their early years, but something steadier, more clear-eyed, a recognition that this man, flawed and fallen as he had shown himself to be, was nonetheless trying, in ways both small and large, to become someone worthy of the trust she had once given him so freely. She did not tell him that night how she felt. She was still too cautious for that, still too aware of how easily hope could curdle into another disappointment. But she began, slowly, to let herself imagine a future again, not the future she had once assumed she would have, unmarred by betrayal, but a different one, harder one and perhaps, in its own strange way, more honest. The real test came in late August, nearly 5 months after the discovery, when Margaret learned that Elena would be attending the same regional business conference Richard was required to attend that year, an unavoidable professional obligation that Richard had disclosed to Margaret the moment he learned of it, rather than hiding it and hoping she would never find out. This disclosure alone marked a significant departure from the man who had once compartmentalized his affair so thoroughly that Margaret had never suspected a thing. But disclosure was one thing. Margaret needed to know what Richard would actually do when faced with the woman who had, for a time, made him feel like the version of himself he had missed being. Margaret did not ask Richard not to go. She understood that his career, at this stage of his life, was not something either of them could simply discard, and more than that, she understood that if their marriage was going to survive, it needed to survive real tests, not carefully avoided ones. She told Richard only that she trusted him to make the right choice, though privately she spent the 3 days of the conference in a state of anxious vigilance that she was almost ashamed of, checking her phone constantly, unable to fully concentrate even as she graded a stack of summer reading reports for the students who would be entering her classroom in the fall. Richard called her every evening of the conference, unprompted, describing his days in detail, which sessions he had attended, which colleagues he had run into, and on the second evening, almost as an aside, he mentioned that he had seen Elena across the hotel lobby, that she had approached him during a coffee break and asked if they could talk privately. Margaret's heart had seized at this, bracing for a story that would break something in her all over again. But Richard told her, in a voice that Margaret recognized as genuinely steady rather than performed, that he had told Elena, plainly and without cruelty, that what had happened between them had been a mistake born of his own weakness and dissatisfaction, that he was working to rebuild his marriage, and that he needed her to respect that by not contacting him again. He said Elena had not taken it well, that she had accused him of using her and then discarding her once his conscience caught up with him, and that he understood why she felt that way, even as he stood firm. He told Margaret all of this without minimizing his own culpability, without trying to paint himself as the wronged party in the situation, which Margaret recognized, with a small, cautious swell of relief, as exactly the kind of accountability she had been waiting 5 months to see. When Richard came home from that conference, Margaret met him at the door, and for the first time since the discovery, she embraced him not out of habit or obligation but because she genuinely wanted to, because something in her had begun to believe, however tentatively, that the man standing in front of her was trying to become someone different from the man who had broken her trust in the first place. It was not a fairy tale reconciliation, not a scene from a movie where all wounds instantly heal. Margaret still had moments of doubt in the months that followed, still occasionally found herself blindsided by grief over what had been lost, the particular, irretrievable innocence of a marriage that had once felt unbreakable. But she also began to notice, with growing clarity, that she and Richard were building something different now, something built not on assumption but on active, daily choice, the choice to be honest, the choice to show up, the choice to keep trying even when it would have been easier to give up or to simply go through the motions. Their marriage counseling continued through the fall, and in one of their later sessions, Dr. Castellan asked Margaret a question that Margaret found herself turning over in her mind for weeks afterward, whether she believed forgiveness meant forgetting, or whether it meant something else entirely. Margaret had thought about this for a long moment before answering that she did not think she would ever forget what had happened, that the memory of that Tuesday in April would likely stay with her for the rest of her life, a scar she would carry even as the wound itself healed. But she said that she had come to understand forgiveness not as forgetting, but as a choice to stop letting the wound define the entirety of what came after, a choice to let Richard's growth, however imperfect, count for something, even as she remained honest about the pain his choices had caused. By the following spring, almost exactly a year after Margaret had first seen Elena's name light up on Richard's phone, their marriage had become something Margaret could only describe as different, in the truest sense of the word, not restored to what it had been before, because that version of their marriage, the one built on assumed trust rather than earned trust, no longer existed and perhaps never should have in the first place. What existed instead was a marriage that had been, in its own painful way, rebuilt from the studs, each beam examined and reinforced rather than simply painted over. Richard had continued the small, unglamorous work of showing up, of asking real questions, of being honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, and Margaret had continued the equally difficult work of choosing, day after day, to let him prove himself rather than either abandoning the marriage entirely or pretending the betrayal had never happened. Claire, home for a visit that spring, watched her parents laughing together in the kitchen over a batch of badly burnt cookies, and later told her mother, quietly, that she had started to believe her father might actually have become a better man, not because he said so, but because she had watched him become one, slowly, in 100 small actions over the course of a year. Margaret often thought back, in the months and years that followed, to that Tuesday afternoon with the towel balled up in her lap, and she came to understand that the version of herself sitting on the edge of that bed could not have imagined the road that lay ahead, could not have imagined that the very worst moment of her marriage might eventually become the hinge point around which something more honest, more resilient, was built. She did not believe, and would not have wanted anyone to believe, that betrayal was somehow worth it, that every marriage touched by infidelity would find its way to this kind of ending. She knew, from Dorothy and from her own hard-won clarity, that not every story ends this way, that sometimes the damage is too deep, or the person who caused it too unwilling to truly change, and that a woman in her position is never obligated to stay and wait for a transformation that may never come. But for Margaret and Richard, in this particular telling, the story had bent, painfully and slowly, towards something like grace. If this story has touched something in you, if it has made you think about the people in your own life, about the marriages and friendships and families that have weathered storms you never expected them to survive, I would love for you to leave a comment below sharing what this story has taught you about forgiveness, about second chances, or about the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust after it has been broken. Perhaps you have lived through something like this yourself, on one side of it or the other, and perhaps your story has something to teach the rest of us who are listening. Our community grows richer every time someone is brave enough to share their own truth in the comments, and I read every single one. In the years since that spring, Margaret has continued teaching 3rd grade, continued coming home to the same brick house on Larkspur Lane, though the house itself has changed in small ways: new curtains in the kitchen, a garden Richard finally built along the back fence after years of promising to, a framed photograph on the mantel now of the two of them on a trip to the coast they took to mark their 20th anniversary, both of them windblown and laughing in a way that Margaret, looking at the photograph now, recognizes as genuinely happy rather than merely composed for the camera. She still thinks, sometimes, about Elena, wonders in idle moments what became of her, whether she found the kind of love she had been seeking in someone else's marriage, though Margaret has made a quiet peace with the fact that this is no longer her concern to carry. What she carries instead is the knowledge that she chose, in the hardest season of her life, to seek clarity rather than either blind forgiveness or reflexive destruction, to watch a person's actions rather than simply accept their words, and that this choice, difficult as it was, gave her marriage the chance to become something worth having again. If you believe, as Margaret came to believe, that people are capable of change when they are willing to do the real, humbling work required of them, and if you believe that forgiveness is not weakness but one of the harder forms of strength a person can practice, then please take a moment to like this video, to share it with someone in your life who might need to hear tonight that broken things can sometimes be mended, and to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this. 1. Our family of viewers has grown because people keep choosing to believe in stories like Margaret's, stories that do not pretend life is simple, but that insist, gently and stubbornly, that hope is always worth holding on to. Thank you for walking through this story with me today, and I will see you in the next one.